Somewhere between who a person is and what they're capable of, there's a space that psychology has never fully mapped. Today's case lives in that space, and the deeper you go into it, the less certain you become about things you thought were fixed. Let's get into it.
In the summer of 1985, a taxi rolled to a stop outside a small home in Cedar Grove, Louisiana. The morning air was still, heavy with humidity, but something was off. The driver watched as a woman named Shirley stepped out, walked to the front door, knocked, then froze. Through the glass, she could see movement, something strange. Within seconds, she was running back to the cab, screaming. The driver radioed for help. When police arrived minutes later, they walked into a nightmare so disturbing that even hardened investigators would never forget what they saw. It started with a single bedroom where two adults lay motionless. One had been shot, the other stabbed, throat slashed. Down the hall, a teenage girl was face down, her hands tied behind her back with an electrical cord. Her mouth had been duct taped, and her body told the story of unrelenting violence. In the bathroom, a woman slumped over a tub, her face bruised, strangled, and drowned. Two children hiding in a closet had survived, but they would carry that memory forever. The killer left no message, no signature, just silence and questions. And what nobody knew then was that this wasn't the beginning. It was the middle of something much darker, something that had been building for years. Nathaniel Robert Code Jr. was born in 1956. His parents split when he was barely 6 months old. He was handed off to relatives, his great aunt and grandfather, who raised him in a modest Shreveport home. As a child, people noticed things. He would drift off mid-sentence, eyes glassy, as if something inside him had momentarily left the room. Teachers chalked it up to distraction. Family shrugged it off as odd behavior, but those who watched closer saw something colder, something unsettling. By his teens, Code had developed a fascination with fire. Animals started disappearing. Neighbors talked, but no one pressed. At 15, during an argument with his uncle, he was shot 4 times. He managed to run several blocks before collapsing in the street. When police arrived, he named his uncle as the shooter. The trauma left no visible scars, but something in him changed after that. In 1975, at age 19, Code was arrested for breaking into a woman's home and sexually assaulting her. He pled guilty to a reduced charge and was sentenced to 15 years. While in prison, his biological mother passed away. He didn't attend the funeral. He didn't speak about her. He didn't cry. Inmates who knew him described him as unpredictable, prone to sudden anger, and eerily calm afterward. In January 1984, after serving just under a decade, he was released early for good behavior. By that spring, he had a job at a local construction company and was trying to rebuild. But beneath the surface, pressure was building again. In August of that same year, it broke. Deborah Ann Ford, 25, lived alone in a quiet neighborhood not far from where Code was staying. On the night of August 31st, he crept through her bathroom window, entered her living room, and attacked. He tied her hands, gagged her mouth, then stabbed her repeatedly. He slit her throat and left her bleeding, face down on her sofa. No robbery, no sign of struggle, no witnesses. Her murder made the papers, but generated few leads. Investigators called it a mystery. Less than a year later, he struck again, this time with unimaginable force. July 19th, 1985. A massacre. 4 bodies. The entire Cheney-Colbert household annihilated. Vivian Cheney, 34. Her daughter Carlitha, 15. Her brother Jerry, 25. Billy Joe Harris, 28. Every detail of the scene screamed rage, but also control. The victims had been bound with cords, their mouths sealed, their deaths methodical. Carlitha's throat had been cut with such intensity it nearly severed her head. Vivian's body was bruised and waterlogged, suggesting a slow, terrifying death. Evidence showed she had watched her daughter die before she was killed. The surviving children, 2 girls aged 7 and 10, had witnessed it all from a hiding place. They told officers that a man had come in quietly, that he didn't yell, that he worked fast. Authorities were stumped. The killer hadn't left fingerprints or left any obvious trace. But one profiler, a man from the FBI named John Douglas, began studying the case. He saw patterns, signs of control, domination, rage. He told police they weren't dealing with random violence. They were dealing with someone who enjoyed the power of it. 2 years passed before the killer resurfaced. August 1987, Shreveport again. This time, the victim was William Code, Nathaniel's own grandfather. 73 years old, he had raised the boy as a son, but now he was found bound, gagged, and stabbed 13 times. 2 children who were visiting the home that night, Joe Robinson Jr., 12, and Eric Williams, 8, were also killed. Both boys had been strangled, tied, and left in separate rooms. Nothing was stolen. There was no forced entry. But police noticed something else. The violence seemed personal. That connection triggered alarms. Nathaniel Code had a known history with William. He had also served time. He was nearby. He was now a person of interest. Investigators brought him in for questioning. Just routine, they said. During the interview, Code slipped up. Something small, a phrase, a detail he shouldn't have known. It wasn't enough to arrest him, but it was enough to collect his fingerprints. What came back changed everything. The prints matched evidence found at the Cheney-Colbert crime scene. And then, they matched the Ford murder from 1984. Suddenly, 3 cases snapped together like puzzle pieces. The killer had a name, and he had been right there all along. In 1990, Nathaniel Code stood trial, but not for all 8 murders. Prosecutors focused on the Cedar Grove slayings, 4 victims, 1 horrific night. Witnesses described him as polite, hard-working, loyal. Others said he was short-tempered, brooding, manipulative. One man claimed he saw Code with blood on his arms the morning after the murders. Code never testified. His lawyers argued the killings were too elaborate for one person. They pointed to his mental health history, suggesting borderline personality disorder. The jury wasn't convinced. After just an hour of deliberation, they found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Code filed appeals, all unsuccessful. He remains on death row at Louisiana State Penitentiary. In 2013, he made headlines again, not for violence, but for comfort. He sued the prison over the heat, claiming the temperatures inside his cell reached dangerous levels. Families of the victims responded with disbelief. They reminded the world what he had taken: lives, futures, innocence. The little girls who survived Cedar Grove grew up, but they never forgot. The scars left by that night never healed. And Nathaniel Code, the man who once slipped through the cracks of every system designed to stop him, now waits behind bars. The heat in his cell rises each summer. But for those who remember what he did, it's nothing compared to the fire he brought into their lives. Charles William Davis Jr. moved through life like a smudge on glass, always present, rarely noticed, and somehow forgotten even when people looked straight at him. Born in 1947 in Baltimore, Maryland, the son of a city police officer, he grew up in a working-class neighborhood where nothing about his early years raised alarms. There are no dramatic stories from his childhood, no outbursts, no criminal record, no obvious red flags. He graduated high school, served in the US Navy, and eventually trained as a lab technician. But what few realized then was that Davis had begun studying something else entirely: human behavior, vulnerability, and the subtle ways people let their guard down when they think they're in safe hands. After the Navy, he began volunteering with ambulance crews and working with hospitals in and around Baltimore. He learned the systems, the uniforms, the language of authority, and how to slip past suspicion simply by being helpful. He showed up where people were hurt, where there was blood, and in those moments, people trusted him. That trust became his disguise. In December 1975, 23-year-old nursing student Kathleen Cook finished her shift at a hospital late at night and walked to her car in a dimly lit parking lot. She never made it home. Her body was found the next morning, slumped beside her vehicle, shot 4 times in the chest. Her purse hadn't been stolen, there were no signs of a struggle, and nothing at the scene made sense, just precision, like someone had executed her and vanished. Police questioned co-workers, friends, patients, everyone except the man who had occasionally volunteered in the ER just weeks prior. 8 months later, 22-year-old Peggy Pumpian, working late at a laundromat near her home, was approached by a man claiming to be a technician responding to a report of faulty wiring. He was calm, courteous, carried a clipboard, and wore a patch that mimicked a real local service. Witnesses later remembered seeing her talking to him just before she stepped into the parking lot and disappeared. Her body was discovered days later in a grassy, overgrown lot outside the city. A single bullet to the head, hands bound, clothes carefully rearranged. No evidence of sexual assault, no theft, no fingerprints, just clinical, almost sterile violence. These weren't frenzied killings. They were structured, controlled, cold. Police never linked the cases. There was nothing obvious to tie them together. Different locations, different methods, no common social circles. But Davis wasn't done. In early 1977, he escalated. Carol Willingham, 24, was abducted while leaving a grocery store parking lot just before dusk. This time, Davis didn't just kill. He sexually assaulted her, beat her, and then executed her with a bullet behind the ear before dumping her body in a drainage ditch. This murder broke his pattern of surgical neatness. Carol fought back, clawed his face, screamed loud enough for passing cars to hear. Security footage captured his car, blurry but identifiable. Investigators now had a vehicle and a partial timeline. Weeks later, when Davis relocated to Nevada, he attempted to abduct another woman using the same fake EMT approach. But this time, she fought back hard and escaped. She got a good look at his face. He was arrested on the spot. And back in Baltimore, detectives finally connected the dots. They tracked his volunteer logs, mapped his movements, and found undeniable links to all 3 murders. When confronted, Davis didn't flinch. He confessed, not because of guilt, but because the game was over. He recited the murders like someone describing a well-practiced routine, recalling details about each woman's final moments, the exact words they said, the way they pleaded or cried or froze. When police searched his apartment, they found a horrifying collection of trophies, bracelets, earrings, photos, hospital badges, and driver's licenses, each one belonging to a woman who was now either confirmed dead or still missing. In a locked drawer, they discovered a journal, pages filled with lists of names, times, and codes. There were entries marked with only dates and GPS coordinates. Investigators realized they were looking at a personal kill log, a methodical archive of a man who'd been hunting women undetected for years, possibly even before Kathleen Cook. Some names in that journal were never matched to missing persons. Some were only initials. Some had no markings at all, just blank lines. Davis was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murders of Cook, Pumpian, and Willingham. Detectives privately believed there were many more victims, but with limited physical evidence and a killer who had no interest in elaborating beyond what was already known, the rest of the cases went cold. For decades, he spoke to no one. Until March 2025, detectives revisiting the cold case of 24-year-old Roseanne Sturtz, who vanished after a night out in Columbia, Maryland, discovered her name buried in one of Davis's old journals. With no leads in nearly 50 years, they reached out to the now 91-year-old inmate. To their surprise, he confessed immediately. He remembered her, remembered offering her a ride, remembered strangling her in his car while promising to take her home. He even described the wooded ravine off Route 108 where he left her body. It was quiet, he said, and no one would look there. That confession, nearly 5 decades later, closed one more chapter, but opened others because his journal still holds names the police can't match, coordinates that don't lead to any known victim, and references to crimes no one has reported. The old woman's hands were caked in dried blood when police finally kicked down her apartment door in 1995. But what made the veteran officers stumble backward wasn't the gore. It was the smell of rot mixed with incense. The woman who opened the door had drumsticks in her hands when police arrived, not the kind you'd get with a KFC order. These were taiko sticks, thick wooden batons designed to pound traditional Japanese drums, and they were crusted with something dark that investigators would later confirm was human blood and tissue. 6 rotting corpses were stacked in Sachiko Eto's house like cordwood, and the smell had been seeping through the walls for months. But understanding how a seemingly ordinary housewife became the drumstick killer requires going back to before the drums, before the bodies started piling up in her home. Sachiko Eto was born on August 21, 1947, in the same city where she'd eventually orchestrate her murders. Post-war Japan was rebuilding itself, and Sachiko grew up in what all accounts describe as an unremarkable childhood. She wasn't abused, she wasn't traumatized, she was just ordinary. She attended school like everyone else, graduated high school, and married her classmate, a painter, like thousands of other young Japanese women in the 1960s. They settled into domestic life. She worked selling cosmetics, he painted. They had 3 daughters. For decades, Sachiko Eto was nobody special, nobody dangerous, nobody worth a second glance. The wheels started coming off in 1990. Her husband injured his back severely enough that he couldn't work anymore. Instead of recovering, instead of adapting, he discovered gambling. Not casual gambling, the kind that becomes an addiction, the kind that devours savings accounts and spits out debt. They'd built a new home. Now they were about to lose it. The man who'd been her high school sweetheart, the father of her children, transformed into a liability. The ordinary life she'd constructed was collapsing, and Sachiko was watching everything she'd built over 20+ years of marriage crumble into nothing. Desperate people do desperate things. Sachiko and her husband turned to religion, specifically to a Shinto-linked organization called Ogamiya-san that practiced spiritual faith healing. For people drowning in debt and disappointment, the promise of supernatural intervention probably felt like the only lifeline left. But the ethos took it too far. They started using the organization's name without permission, running their own unauthorized version of the healing practice. When headquarters found out, they were kicked out, cast adrift again. Then in 1992, Sachiko's husband vanished, just disappeared. No body was ever found. The official story was that he'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown and wandered off. But there were always whispers, questions that never quite got answered. Because by the time anyone thought to ask them seriously, Sachiko had already moved on to building something much darker. She relocated to another part of Sakagawa and reinvented herself completely. The cosmetic saleswoman became a spiritual healer. The ordinary housewife became a self-proclaimed psychic, with the power to cure ailments and drive out demons. And here's the terrifying part. People believed her. She had a gift for reading vulnerability, for identifying exactly what broken people needed to hear. The lonely, the sick, the desperate. They came to her looking for answers, and she gave them a reason to stay. By 1994, Sachiko wasn't just seeing clients. She'd created a full cult, though she'd have called it a religious group. About a dozen core believers and their family members had moved into her home, creating a commune where she ruled as absolute spiritual authority. She claimed to be a messenger of God. Some accounts suggest she went further, claiming to be a god herself. Her followers believed it. Why wouldn't they? She could see into their souls. She could identify the demons hiding inside them. She alone had the power to drive those demons out. The exorcisms started small, chanting, rituals, the rhythmic pounding of taiko drums that neighbors heard day and night. Traditional exorcism practices in Japan can involve some physical elements, but Sachiko Eto twisted the concept into something unrecognizable. The drumsticks that were supposed to strike instruments started striking flesh instead, because Sachiko had decided that the only way to purify the soul was to destroy the body containing it, to beat the demons out, to literally drum evil from flesh and bone. And she had help. Her 23-year-old daughter Yuko participated. So did a 45-year-old follower named Mitsuo Sekine. But the most dedicated assistant was 21-year-old Hiroshi Nemoto, Sachiko's lover, young enough to be her son, devoted enough to kill at her command. The first victim, whose death can be confirmed, was part of a family of 3. Mamoru Miki, 50 years old, came to Sachiko seeking healing. He brought his wife Kazuko, 48, and their teenage daughter Satoe, just 18. They believed Sachiko could cure their ailments. They believed in her power. That belief killed them. Starting in December 1994, Sachiko identified demons within the Miki family. The exorcisms that followed weren't quick. They weren't merciful. Sachiko and her accomplices beat them repeatedly with the thick wooden taiko sticks, instruments that in any other context would produce music, but in her hands became weapons of prolonged torture. The sessions went on for hours, days. The victims would be forced to endure ritual after ritual, chanting filling the air while wood connected with bone and flesh over and over. The Mikis suffered fractures, internal bleeding, organ damage. When they lost consciousness, the beatings continued. When they stopped breathing, no one called for medical help. Their bodies were left to rot in Sachiko's home, while she moved on to identifying the next demon. And Sachiko saw them not as human beings deserving of care, but as objects to be used and discarded. The 18-year-old girl, Satoe Miki, had her entire life ahead of her. Instead, she died in agony at the hands of a woman claiming divine authority, while her parents were killed alongside her. Kazuko's sister, Kimiko Sekine, was 46 when she died under the same drums. Tatsuo Igai, 42, met the same end. Then Akemi Senzaki, only 27 years old, was beaten to death in the name of spiritual purification. Here's what the court records later revealed about Sachiko's motivations. At least one victim was killed out of pure jealousy. When Sachiko decided that a female follower was showing too much interest in her young lover Hiroshi Nemoto, she declared the woman possessed by a bad fox and had her beaten nearly to death. Another victim's demon was apparently refusing to loan Sachiko money. The exorcisms weren't about faith or spirituality. They were about control, about eliminating anyone who threatened Sachiko's authority or failed to serve her needs. The bodies accumulated in her house throughout late 1994 and into 1995. 6 human beings reduced to corpses hidden in rooms where other followers still lived and prayed and believed. The smell grew worse. The drums kept pounding. Sachiko's power over her remaining followers was so complete that even with death literally rotting in the walls around them, they didn't question her. They didn't run. They didn't call police. This is the truly disturbing aspect of cult psychology. The ability of a charismatic leader to completely warp reality for their followers. These people were living in a house with decomposing bodies and still believed Sachiko was divine, still trusted her judgment, still participated in her rituals, until one of them ended up in the hospital. In June 1995, another follower received a beating severe enough that she needed medical attention. When hospital staff saw her injuries and heard fragments of her story about exorcisms and the spiritual leader, red flags went up. Someone contacted authorities. By July 5th, police had enough concern to search Sachiko's home. What they found made even veteran investigators stumble backward. 6 decomposing bodies in various states of decay, evidence of prolonged brutal violence, taiko drumsticks stained with biological matter, and Sachiko Eto herself, calm and unrepentant, still convinced of her own divine authority, even as handcuffs closed around her wrists. The arrest sent shockwaves through Japan, a country that prides itself on safety and low crime rates. But what made it even more shocking was the timing. Just months earlier, in March 1995, the Aum Shinrikyo cult had released sarin gas in Tokyo's subway system, killing 13 people and injuring thousands. Japan was already reeling from one cult massacre. Now, here was another cult leader, another set of bodies, another reminder that dangerous extremism was flourishing in unexpected corners of Japanese society. The trial revealed the full scope of her manipulation. Sachiko's defense attorneys argued she'd been mentally ill, suffering from delusions, operating under diminished capacity. She pleaded not guilty, but prosecutors painted a different picture of a woman who'd positioned herself as a deified ruler, who'd used claims of demonic possession as a mechanism to eliminate threats to her power, who'd shown no remorse even after her arrest. She continued insisting her victims had been possessed, continued claiming her actions were spiritually necessary. The courts didn't buy it. On November 16, 2001, the Fukushima District Court requested a death sentence for Sachiko Eto. Her daughter Yuko and Mitsuo Sekine got life imprisonment. Her lover, Hiroshi Nemoto, received 18 years. The ruling stated her crimes were excessively grave. She'd abused absolute power over vulnerable people, destroyed 6 lives through sustained torture masked as faith, and showed zero genuine remorse. Sachiko appealed. The Sendai High Court rejected her appeal in 2005. The Supreme Court dismissed it in 2008. She'd become the 10th woman sentenced to death in post-war Japan, and legal scholars analyzed her case alongside Aum Shinrikyo, trying to understand how cult dynamics could lead to such devastating violence. Both cases revealed the same dangerous pattern: a charismatic leader who claimed special spiritual knowledge, vulnerable followers desperate for answers, and a closed environment where reality could be completely rewritten. Sachiko Eto spent 17 years on death row. During that time, according to prison officials, she was quiet, polite, unremarkable. The monster who'd beaten followers to death with drumsticks became an elderly woman who caused no trouble, made no demands, but she also never expressed remorse, never admitted genuine wrongdoing, never acknowledged the humanity of the 6 people she'd destroyed. On the morning of September 27, 2012, at age 65, Sachiko Eto was executed by hanging at Miyagi Prison in Sendai. She was the first woman executed in Japan in 15 years. Her daughter Yuko and Mitsuo Sekin remained in prison serving life sentences. Hiroshi Nemoto, the young lover who'd helped beat people to death to please her, served his time and was eventually released back into society, carrying the weight of what he'd done in the name of devotion. The families of the Mickeys, the father, mother, and 18-year-old daughter who'd sought healing and found only violence, the families of Kimiko Sakine, Tatsuo Igai, and Akemi Senzaki never got adequate answers about why their loved ones had to die, because there was no why that made sense, no explanation that would ever satisfy the fundamental question. How does an ordinary housewife from an ordinary background transform into someone capable of orchestrating 6 murders and calling it divine work? The house where it happened was demolished. The site was cleared. But locals still avoid the area, still tell the story in hushed voices. The drumstick killer, they call her. The woman who claimed God's authority and used it to beat followers to death while drums pounded through the night. What haunts investigators and psychologists who studied the case isn't just what Sachiko did. It's how unremarkable her life was before she did it. Just an ordinary woman who faced ordinary hardships and somehow decided the appropriate response was to declare herself divine, gather vulnerable people around her, and kill them when they failed to serve her needs. She never needed to be special. She just needed people desperate enough to believe she was. And that might be the most frightening realization of all, that someone indistinguishable from millions of other people can, under the right circumstances with the right pressures, decide they're beyond human morality and act accordingly. That the capacity for that kind of evil doesn't announce itself with warning signs and red flags. It just waits, quiet and patient, until debt or loss or desperation cracks something open and lets the darkness pour out. Because Sachiko Eto proves something terrifying about human nature. That evil doesn't always look like evil from the outside. Sometimes it looks like a middle-aged woman who sells cosmetics and raises children and goes to work every day. Sometimes it hides behind claims of spirituality and healing. Sometimes it waits decades before showing itself, lurking beneath the surface of an ordinary life until circumstances align and the mask finally drops. And by the time anyone realizes what they're dealing with, 6 people are already dead. It's May 1924 in Hanover, Germany, and a group of children are playing near the Leine River by Herrenhausen Castle. One of them spots something white lodged in the mud along the riverbank. They wade closer. It's a human skull. The eye sockets stare back at them, empty and accusing. Within 2 weeks, 3 more skulls wash ashore. The police drag the river and pull up over 500 human bones. 22 different people, all young males, all missing their flesh, dumped like garbage into the dark water. And the man responsible? He'd been working as a police informant the entire time, living just blocks away, selling meat door to door that the neighbors described as the most tender pork they'd ever tasted. Friedrich Heinrich Karl Hamann was born on October 25, 1879, in Hanover, the youngest of 6 children in a family that could barely afford to feed themselves. His father, Ollie, was a violent alcoholic who'd contracted syphilis from his numerous affairs. His mother, Johanna, was 7 years older than her husband and came from money, though you wouldn't know it from the squalid conditions they lived in. The marriage was toxic from the start, but little Fritz wasn't like other boys. While his brothers roughhoused and played soldiers, Fritz preferred his sister's dolls. He'd spend hours dressing them, arranging their hair, playing house. His sickly mother encouraged this, perhaps to keep him close, perhaps because she saw him as different and wanted to protect him. His father despised it. The other children mocked him relentlessly. Fritz was quiet, had almost no friends. and seemed to exist in his own strange world. But here's the thing. There was darkness beneath that quiet exterior. He would tie his sisters up and terrorize them, watching their fear with fascination. He once threatened to report his father to the police for supposedly murdering a train driver, a complete fabrication that showed an early talent for manipulation and a disturbing enjoyment of psychological torture. At 16, his parents, desperate to make a man out of him, enrolled Fritz in a military academy. Surprisingly, he thrived there initially. The structure, the uniform, the clear hierarchy, it all seemed to work. He performed well. But after just 1 year, something changed. During a routine exercise, Fritz collapsed. The military doctors examined him and declared him mentally deficient. He was discharged and sent home in disgrace. His father, humiliated and enraged, tried to have him committed to an asylum. The local doctors examined Fritz and pronounced him morally inferior, but not insane enough for institutionalization. He was 20 years old, unemployed, living at home, and going nowhere. He attempted to start a small business. It failed almost immediately, and that's when Fritz Hamann discovered he had a talent for crime. For the next 2 decades, Fritz cycled in and out of prison for burglaries, con jobs, fraud. He became a familiar face to the Hanover police. Arrested so many times, they knew him by his first name. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1918, fresh out of prison and finding Germany devastated by World War I, starving, broken, drowning in poverty and crime, Fritz made a calculation. He approached the Hanover police and offered his services as an informant. He knew the criminal underworld. He could give them names, locations, stolen goods, and incredibly, they accepted. Fritz Hamann, the morally inferior career criminal, became a trusted police informant. He even began telling people he was a detective, and nobody questioned it, because who would lie about being a cop? September 25th, 1918, 17-year-old Friedel Rother, a runaway, disappeared after telling friends he was meeting a man named Fritz. Friedel's family pressured police to investigate. Officers raided Hamann's apartment on Sellerstrasse and found their informant in bed with a half-naked 13-year-old boy. They arrested Fritz for sexual assault of a minor, 9 months in prison. Case closed. But now, here's what the police didn't know. What Fritz later confessed with a smile. While the officers stood in his apartment, while they questioned him, while they looked around his single room, Friedel Roth's severed head was wrapped in newspaper and stuffed behind the stove. They were standing 3 feet from it. After serving his sentence, Fritz went right back to his old life. Police informant, petty criminal, trading in black market goods. And then, in October 1919, he met Hans Granz at the Hanover railway station. Hans was 18. A hustler who'd run away from Berlin after fighting with his father. He approached Fritz, looking to sell himself. Instead, something else happened. Within weeks, Hans moved into Fritz's apartment. Their relationship was complicated, toxic, parasitic. Hans was heterosexual but saw Fritz as a meal ticket. Fritz was utterly infatuated, calling Hans like a son, saying he pulled him out of the gutter. But Hans manipulated Fritz constantly, mocked him, would leave after arguments only for Fritz to beg him to come back. Fritz later said he tolerated it all because he needed someone to mean everything to, someone who depended on him completely. February 12th, 1923, Fritz, now pretending to be a police detective, approached 2 young men at Hanover station. He inspected their papers, sent the ugly one away, and invited 17-year-old Fritz Franke, a pianist from Berlin, back to his apartment. Franke never left. According to Hamann, Hans returned home unexpectedly that night and walked in to find Franke's naked corpse lying on the bed. Hans looked at Fritz, looked at the body, and calmly asked when he should come back. Now remember this detail. That was the beginning of their true partnership. Hans didn't just know about the murders, he participated. He selected victims. When he saw a boy wearing a jacket he liked, he'd point him out to Fritz. "Kill that one," he'd say. "I want his clothes." What happened in that apartment is almost incomprehensible in its brutality. Fritz would lure young men, runaways, homeless boys, prostitutes, anyone vulnerable. He'd offer them work, food, a place to sleep. Once inside, he would attack. His method was always the same. He would bite through their throats. Not just bite, but tear, ripping through the windpipe and arteries in what he called a love bite, killing them in a sexual frenzy. Many of the boys were sodomized as they died. The victims ranged from 10 to 22 years old. Most were teenagers. Fritz later confessed he would become aroused during the killings, that the act of murder and the act of sex were completely intertwined in his mind. He couldn't separate them. After they were dead, the real work began. Fritz would dismember the bodies in his tiny apartment, using a cleaver to hack through bone and sinew. He described the process in detail during his interrogation. 2 cuts in the abdomen. Remove the intestines into a bucket. Soak up the blood. Crush the bones until the shoulders broke. Extract the heart, lungs, kidneys, chop them up. Strip the flesh from the bones. He said he found dismemberment disgusting, that he hated doing it, but that his need to kill was stronger than the horror of the cutting and chopping. The bones and some body parts went into the Lena River, weighted down and thrown in at night. The victims' clothes were sold on the black market by Hans, who made a tidy profit. Hans would even wear his victims' jackets and shirts around town. And the flesh. Here's where the story becomes truly nightmarish. Fritz ran a small meat-selling business on the side. He would go door to door selling what he claimed was pork or horse meat. It was always boneless, always ground or diced. Neighbors later testified it was the most tender, delicious meat they'd ever had. Fritz was never definitively proven to have sold human flesh, but he was known as a butcher. The meat had no traceable source, and he later said he'd obtained it from a man named Carl, who nobody could ever locate. When asked directly about cannibalism, Fritz denied eating his victims. One quote attributed to him, "I've never had such a good meal as human meat." Over the next 16 months, the killings accelerated. Wilhelm Schulze, 17, Roland Huch, 15, Ernst Ehrenburg, 13, the son of Fritz's own neighbor, Heinrich Struss, 18. The list went on and on. Fritz became so brazen he would kill a boy every week and a half. He'd spot them at the train station, always the train station, and approach them with his fake detective credentials. By early 1924, over 600 teenage boys had been reported missing in Hanover. Parents were frantic, police were baffled. And this is important, their trusted informant, Fritz Hamann, was even helping with some of the investigations, offering his expertise on where these boys might have gone. He once showed up at a victim's family home posing as a criminologist, offering to help find their son. Witnesses said he spent the entire visit laughing hysterically. The final victim was 17-year-old Eric de Vries, killed in June 1924. But by then, the skulls had started washing up. The police dragged the river and found the massive bone pile. Suspicion fell on Fritz almost immediately. He'd been connected to Friedel Rother's disappearance back in 1918. He'd been seen with multiple missing boys. They placed him under surveillance. On June 22nd, 2 undercover officers from Berlin watched Fritz prowl the Hanover station. They saw him approach a 15-year-old boy named Karl Fromm and try to lure him away. They arrested him on the spot. When they searched his apartment, they found walls stained with blood from floor to ceiling. Fritz claimed it was from his illegal meat business. They found 400 pieces of clothing belonging to missing boys. They found personal possessions, watches, identity papers. Fritz tried to explain it all away. He was a dealer in used clothing, he said. The blood was from butchering animals, but the evidence was overwhelming. During his interrogation, Fritz confessed to everything. He admitted to at least 24 murders, possibly as many as 70, though police could only confirm 27. He described the killings in graphic detail, his soft, almost feminine voice recounting horrors with a disturbing mixture of shame and pride. Psychiatrists who examined him noted his contradictions. He was hyperactive and calculating, desperate for attention, yet deeply embarrassed. He had soft white hands that moved constantly, plucking at his fingers. His body was strong but feminine. He loved baking and cooking but smoked strong cigars. The doctors said he was like an old woman trapped in a killer's body. When asked why he killed, Fritz said he didn't know. It was a mystery to him. He claimed he never planned the murders. Something would just come over him. He'd see a boy and feel an overwhelming urge. He compared it to a sexual frenzy he couldn't control. The trial began on December 4th, 1924, at the Hanover Assizes and became one of the first modern media spectacles in Germany. Newspapers gave Fritz a series of nicknames: the Butcher of Hanover, the Vampire of Hanover, the Wolfman. 200 witnesses testified. Parents of victims broke down sobbing. Friends described seeing Fritz with the missing boys. Shopkeepers identified clothing Fritz had sold them. Neighbors testified about the parade of young boys entering Fritz's apartment and never leaving, about the strange sounds at night, about asking Fritz where all these boys went, and him laughing it off. The courtroom was packed. By the third day, the judge excluded spectators because the testimony was too gruesome. Hans Granz was tried alongside Fritz. Initially, Hans was sentenced to death for incitement to murder, after witnesses testified they saw him point out 17-year-old Adolf Hannepel to Fritz days before the boy vanished. But a letter from Fritz was discovered declaring Hans's innocence. Hans's sentence was reduced to 12 years. He would serve his time and live quietly in Hanover until around 1975, dying an old man. On December 19, 1924, Fritz Hamann was found guilty of 24 murders. He was acquitted of 3 because he denied them, even though the victims' belongings were found in his possession. At sentencing, he addressed the court with chilling calmness. "Condemn me to death. I ask only for justice. I am not mad. Make it short, make it soon. Deliver me from this life which is a torment. I will not petition for mercy, nor will I appeal. I want to pass just one more merry night in my cell, with coffee, cheese and cigars, after which I will curse my father and go to my execution as if it were a wedding." On April 15, 1925, at dawn, Fritz Hamann was led to the guillotine in Hanover prison. His last words were simple: "I repent, but I do not fear death." The blade fell. Germany's most prolific serial killer was dead at 45. But the story doesn't quite end there. After his execution, Fritz's head was severed from his body again, this time by scientists, and preserved in formaldehyde. They wanted to study his brain, to understand what made him into a monster. His head sat in a jar at Göttingen Medical School for decades. Those same cheerful eyes that had smiled at victims now staring from a specimen jar. Now here's what makes Fritz Hamann so terrifying from a psychological standpoint. He wasn't some raging lunatic. He was functional, even charming. He ran businesses, maintained friendships, worked successfully with police for years. The psychiatrists who examined him were disturbed by how normal he seemed in conversation, how he could switch between discussing the weather and describing brutal murders with the same casual tone. They noted he displayed what we'd now recognize as compartmentalization taken to an extreme. Fritz genuinely believed he was 2 different people. There was Fritz, the helpful informant, the friendly butcher, the businessman. And then there was the other Fritz, the one who couldn't control his urges. He described the killings as something that happened to him, not something he chose. Modern psychologists would likely diagnose him as having severe dissociative episodes combined with sexual sadism disorder. The violence and the sexual gratification were so intertwined in his brain that he literally couldn't experience one without the other. What's more disturbing is that Fritz showed almost no remorse for the acts themselves, only shame at being caught and embarrassment at how he'd be remembered. He wanted to die well, to be seen as brave at the execution, because his ego mattered more than the lives he'd destroyed. He kept a plastic raincoat folded in his bag so the blood wouldn't ruin his clothes on the walk home. 5 men, 5 plastic bags of things taken from each scene that Sydney's detectives couldn't bring themselves to describe in the press. They gave him a name because they had nothing else. The Mutilator. He gave himself a different one, William MacDonald. His name at birth was Allen Ginsberg, born the 17th of June, 1924, in Liverpool, England, the second of 3 children to a wealthy Jewish family, socialites, the kind of people who filled their lives with parties and appearances and the careful performance of success. Their quiet middle son fit none of that. He was withdrawn, interior, the kind of child who seemed to exist slightly outside of whatever room he was standing in. His parents didn't know what to do with him, so largely, they did nothing. They left him alone with his interior world and their neglect and called it raising him. What he wanted, more than almost anything, was to become a concert pianist. A lonely, sensitive boy in wartime Liverpool, pressing his fingers to ivory keys, finding in music the only place where what he felt had somewhere to go. Structure, beauty, control. A world that made sense according to rules he could learn and follow. Hold that image, because it is about to be destroyed completely, and it will never come back. In 1943, at 19 years old, he was conscripted into the British Army. He was transferred to the Lancashire Fusiliers, and one night, in an air raid shelter, in the dark, with bombs falling somewhere in the distance, one of his corporals raped him. What happened in that shelter didn't just wound Allen Ginsberg. It didn't scar him or mark him or leave him damaged in ways that could be identified and treated. It erased him. He would describe it years later as the moment his mind divided itself cleanly into before and after, and the person who existed before simply ceased. What walked out of that shelter was something different, something that would spend the next 2 decades becoming something worse. He was discharged from the army in 1947 with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, institutionalized, subjected to electroconvulsive therapy, which in the late 1940s was not the relatively refined procedure it would later become. It was controlled lightning delivered to a restrained human body. It scorched memory. It rearranged things. Whether it helped him or worsened him, no one could say with any confidence. What it absolutely did not do was fix him. After his release, he was arrested for propositioning a police officer in a public toilet. His family found out. And here is the moment where something final closed, not with violence, not with drama, but with the particular coldness of people who find shame more intolerable than suffering. His parents looked at their son, this damaged, institutionalized, discharged veteran who had been assaulted in a military shelter and had his mind taken apart by electrical current. And what they felt was embarrassment. They turned from him, and that was that. He changed his name, erased Allen Ginsberg from the record, left England for Canada in 1949, then pushed further to Australia in 1955, to the other side of the world where nobody knew who he had been or what had been done to him. He arrived in Adelaide, and within months, he was charged again. Another advance toward a detective in a public toilet. 2-year good behaviour bond. He moved to Ballarat, then Sydney, worked construction, kept to himself, was to every person who encountered him completely and utterly unremarkable. The kind of man you don't remember after he leaves the room. The kind of man whose name you'd struggle to recall an hour later. Quiet, polite, forgettable. But something had been growing in him for years. Something that fed on the silence and the invisibility and the voices he had begun hearing. Actual voices, not metaphorical ones. Voices that spoke to him about the corporal in the shelter and about what should be done to men like that. He had developed an obsession with Jack the Ripper, reading everything he could find, studying the methodology of it, the precision, the geography, the way a person could move through a city and leave bodies and disappear back into the ordinary. He understood by 1961 what he was going to do. He moved into Sydney's Inner East, a neighbourhood thick with boarding houses and cheap wine bars, and the men who lived at the bottom of everything. Drifters, derelicts, men who drank themselves into the pavement and slept in parks and existed in the margins of a city that had already decided not to see them. Men who could disappear without the world noticing for a very long time. He bought a long-bladed knife. He bought plastic bags, and he began to wait. His first victim was a 63-year-old man named Amos Hurst. MacDonald found him outside Roma Street Station in Brisbane and did what he would do many times again. He offered company, warmth, alcohol, the oldest lure in existence. They drank through the afternoon, through the evening, went back to Hurst's flat and drank more. And when Hurst finally dissolved into unconsciousness, MacDonald sat with him in the quiet dark for a while. Then he began to strangle him. Hurst was too far gone to understand what was happening. Blood came up into his mouth. MacDonald punched him in the face, and then it was over. He straightened the body on the bed with a strange, methodical care, pulled the sheets up, tucked them in neatly around the sides, gently almost, the way you might settle someone down for sleep. 5 days later, he found Hurst's name in the obituary column. Misadventure. No investigation. No one had seen him leave. No one was looking for anyone. He had done it and gotten away with it completely. Something settled in him then, something that had been coiled and pressurized for years, and almost immediately, it began to coil again. Alfred Greenfield was 41 years old, sitting on a park bench in Green Park, Darlinghurst, just across the road from St. Vincent's Hospital. That proximity feels almost deliberate. A hospital on one side of the road, and on the other, a man offering a stranger a drink and suggesting they walk to the nearby Domain baths for more. Greenfield went. They sat. They drank. He fell asleep. MacDonald removed his knife from its sheath and stabbed Alfred Greenfield more than 30 times. The first blow opened the arteries in his neck. It didn't stop him. The blade kept moving through the neck, the chest, the abdomen, with a ferocity that, when police arrived at dawn and stood over what remained, stopped men who had worked violent crime for decades cold in their tracks. The body was nude, mutilated. The genitals removed, bagged, and later recovered from Sydney Harbour. The press had no category for this. They reached for the only name that came close. They called him the Mutilator. 30 detectives, almost nothing to work with. Ernest Cobbin was 37 years old. MacDonald walked him to a public toilet at Moore Park on a November night in 1961. Before entering, MacDonald stopped and put on a plastic raincoat. He had brought it with him. He had thought about what was coming, had decided what he would need, had folded it and carried it to the scene. This was not anger. This was not impulse. This was a man who had ironed his raincoat before going out to kill someone. Cobbin was sitting on the toilet seat when the knife came up into his neck in a single upward stroke, severing the jugular. He raised his arms. MacDonald stabbed through them. Cobbin went still. MacDonald kept going, the blade rising and falling in the locked cubicle, the walls and the floor, and the plastic raincoat receiving everything, until he had to stop for breath. He washed his face and hands at a tap outside and walked home through the Sydney night like a man returning from work. On the 31st of March, 1962, MacDonald walked into a sports store on Pitt Street and bought a new knife. That same evening, he followed Frank McLean out of the Oxford Hotel in Darlinghurst and walked behind him in the dark, close enough to talk, casual enough to seem safe, until he steered him into the narrow throat of Bourke Lane. McLean was drunk. He didn't understand what was wrong until the knife entered his throat. He fought, drunk and bleeding and bewildered. Frank McLean fought, grabbing, twisting, trying to get purchase on something. MacDonald stabbed him in the face. punched him down, and then knelt over him in the dark lane and worked until there was nothing left to do. Then he heard it, a pram, wheels on cobblestone, a baby's cry echoing off the lane walls, a young family turning the corner, a man, a woman, their child, walking directly toward him. MacDonald pressed himself against the wall and stood absolutely still in the dark. The family passed within meters of him. The baby cried, the parents murmured. The wheels rattled away down the street. When the silence came back, he returned to McLean. In the days that followed, MacDonald read every newspaper account of the Frank McLean murder. He tracked the investigation in print. He watched his own handiwork become headlines. And then, and this is documented, he attended Frank McLean's funeral. He stood among the mourners. He may have bowed his head over the grave of the man he had destroyed in a back lane 4 nights earlier. Police, examining the wounds, had become convinced the killer was a surgeon. The cuts were too precise, too knowing, the anatomy too deliberately addressed. They were building a profile of a man with medical training, professional detachment, a clinical mind. They were not wrong about the detachment. They were wrong about everything else. By mid-1962, MacDonald had reinvented himself again. He had purchased a small mixed business shop in the Sydney suburb of Concord under the name Alan Edward Brennan. He made sandwiches. He sold small goods behind a counter. He lived in the rooms above the store and told himself, in whatever part of his mind still spoke in something like reason, that having his own space would help him manage what lived inside him. On a Saturday night in June 1962, he met James Hackett at a wine bar on Pitt Street. Hackett was 42, a thief, a drifter, recently out of prison. They drank. MacDonald brought him back to the shop. They drank more. Hackett fell asleep on the floor. MacDonald went downstairs to the shop, picked up the boning knife he used in the delicatessen, and came back upstairs. He drove it into Hackett's neck. The blow went clean through. Hackett woke up, which MacDonald had not anticipated, and grabbed the blade with both hands, forcing it backward into MacDonald's palm, opening it to the bone. What happened in that room over the next minutes resists clean description. MacDonald, bleeding from his own hand, attacked Hackett with a totality of violence that outlasted the knife's ability to cut. He stabbed through bone. The blade went blunt. He kept going. When Hackett finally stopped moving, MacDonald sat down in the blood, which was everywhere, which was all of it, which covered everything in that small room above a sandwich shop in Concord, and fell asleep where he sat, next to the body. In the morning, he went to a hospital and told a doctor he'd caught his hand on something in the shop. He came back, dragged Hackett beneath the floorboards, cleaned what he could, and then, paranoia flooding in, the certainty that police were already watching, already moving, he locked the door of Alan Brennan's life, walked away from it entirely, and fled. 3 weeks later, the neighbors rang the health department about a smell coming from the shop. Police found what was left of James Hackett beneath the floorboards on the 20th of November, 1962. The decomposition was so advanced, the body was nearly unidentifiable. They cross-referenced the missing person records for Alan Brennan. The shopkeeper, the alias, matched the description and concluded that the dead man in the floor was MacDonald himself. They published an obituary. Former workmates from the post office held a small memorial service. And here is where this story does something almost impossible. A man, a former colleague, someone who had worked alongside MacDonald, read the obituary and felt something was wrong because he had seen MacDonald, alive, walking the streets of Sydney. After the date he was supposed to have died, he went to the police. They dismissed him. He went to a journalist. The journalist ran the story. The headline became famous. The case of the walking corpse. It forced police to exhume the body. Fingerprints came back as James Hackett. And on closer inspection, the mutilation signature was there. The mutilator hadn't been rotting beneath the floorboards. The mutilator had been behind the counter. The quiet man making sandwiches. Alan Brennan, William MacDonald. police circulated an identikit image to every newspaper in the country. MacDonald had taken work at Spencer Street Railway Station in Melbourne under yet another false name. He had dyed his hair, grown a moustache, kept his head low in the noise and movement of a busy station, among hundreds of faces nobody looked at twice. His workmates saw the image in the paper. On the 13th of May, 1963, as MacDonald walked to the window to collect his wages, the police closed in from three sides. He didn't run. Under questioning, he began to talk, and he didn't stop. Over 100 pages of confession. Every victim, every location, every blade, every bag. At his trial in September 1963, he testified in such precise, unhurried detail about what he had done and how and why that members of the jury fainted in their seats. He was found guilty on all counts, 5 consecutive life sentences. The judge attached a personal recommendation. This man should never be released. MacDonald received the sentence without expression, without anything. He spent 50 years inside. Australia's oldest prisoner, the longest-serving inmate in New South Wales history. Somewhere in those decades, the institution stopped being a place he was kept and became the only world he could imagine inhabiting. When parole was offered, he turned it down. Every time. "I am institutionalized now," he said in an interview years before his death. "I have no desire to go and live on the outside. I wouldn't last 5 minutes." He never apologized, never expressed remorse in any form, the record shows. In private, he acknowledged that the urges had never left him, that had he remained free, the killing would not have stopped at 5, would not have stopped at all. On the 12th of May, 2015, William MacDonald died in the secure ward of Long Bay Hospital. He was 90 years old. A woman and her teenage daughter were found so savagely mutilated inside their own home that the detective who walked through the front door that morning had to step back outside and collect himself before he could continue. He had been doing this job for over 2 decades. He had seen things most people couldn't imagine, but he had never seen anything like this. His name was Jack Owen Spillman, and he believed, with total sincerity, that he was a werewolf. He was born Roy Wilson on August 30th, 1969, in Spokane, Washington, a place that looked, on the surface, like any other quiet corner of the Pacific Northwest. His mother cycled through 4 husbands and had 4 children, none of whom ever knew with any certainty who their father was. There was no stability in that house, no anchor. Jack was adopted by one of his mother's partners, given the man's name, and left largely to figure the world out on his own. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade. He drifted. He lived alone in a trailer in Spokane Valley, isolated and largely invisible to the people around him. But inside that trailer, Jack Spillman was building something. He read obsessively, not novels, not history, books on serial killers, forensic manuals. He studied how investigators caught people. He studied what mistakes killers made. He was meticulous about it, almost academic, in the way someone might prepare for a career. He shaved his body hair to avoid leaving trace evidence. He thought about surveillance, entry points, escape routes. To the outside world, he was a low-level laborer, unremarkable, forgettable, a nobody. That was exactly what he wanted people to think. He also began collecting wolves, figurines, images, anything with wolves on it. His sisters noticed, thought it was just an odd hobby. It wasn't. In his mind, Jack Spillman had stopped being a man. He had convinced himself he was a predator, something primal and hunting, and the people around him were prey. He told this to a cellmate years later, without a flicker of embarrassment. He described stalking women the way a wolf stalks through undergrowth, patient, invisible, relentless. His criminal record started in 1982 and never really stopped. Indecent exposure, theft, assault, burglary, rape charges that were eventually dropped. He slipped through the cracks of the justice system repeatedly. In 1993, He and a friend were arrested for sexual assault. The charges were dropped. He walked, and he kept watching. By late 1994, he had been spending time with a family in Tonasket, a small town in Okanagan County, a place so rural that neighbors were separated by miles of open land. He had stayed with the family on occasion, through some loose connection to the mother. He had been watching the older daughter, but it was the younger one, 9-year-old Penny Davis, who became his first known victim. The details of what happened to Penny Davis are largely shielded from public record, a deliberate decision by investigators to protect what remained of the child's dignity. What is known is this: Spillman took her. He brought her to a cave in the surrounding woodland. He later told his cellmate she had died too quickly, that she had bled out from a wound to the throat before he could do everything he had planned. He said it with frustration, the way a craftsman might describe a job that went wrong. He buried her body approximately 12 miles from her home, in a shallow grave dug into the forest floor. He said nothing to anyone. For 6 months, Penny Davis was simply missing. Her family searched. The community searched. Spillman said nothing, went nowhere near the investigation. And then, when enough time had passed, he went back to the grave. He exhumed her body. He used it, buried her. He did this more than once. When her remains were eventually found in early 1995, investigators could not conclusively determine cause of death. The case went cold. Spillman moved on. By the spring of 1995, he had fixed his attention on Amanda Huffman, 15 years old, a student in East Wenatchee, Washington. For months, Amanda had no idea she was being hunted. She went to school. She came home. She lived the ordinary, unremarkable life of a teenage girl in a quiet Washington town, completely unaware that a man was memorizing the details of that life with cold, methodical precision. Spillman knew what time the lights went out in her bedroom. He knew the route she walked. He had studied which door her mother left unlocked at the back of the house. He had reduced her entire existence to a set of patterns, entry points and timings, the way you'd study a building before a robbery, except the thing he intended to take could not be returned. He was also employed as a butcher during this period, a detail that would later make forensic investigators pause in grim recognition. This is the part that disturbed investigators almost as much as the crimes themselves, not the violence, which was at least comprehensible as an act of catastrophic human failure, but the months of quiet, disciplined watching. The fact that he moved through the edges of Amanda Huffman's daily life like a shadow she never once noticed. For week after week after week, he wasn't impulsive. He wasn't unraveling. He was organized. He was waiting for exactly the right moment, and he was perfectly comfortable in the dark. Her mother, Rita, was a 48-year-old car saleswoman, warm, well-liked in the community. She had no idea that a man had been circling her home after nightfall, cataloging every detail of her family's routine. On the night of April 17, 1995, Spillman, dressed in black, drove his 1978 Chevy pickup to the neighborhood and waited. A witness would later place his truck near the house at around 11:30 that night. There was no forced entry. Rita sometimes left the back sliding door unlocked. He knew this. He had been watching long enough to know. What he did inside that house was described in court documents with clinical language that still managed to make seasoned investigators physically ill. Rita Huffman was stabbed 31 times in the chest, the neck, and across her body. The wounds were precise, deliberate. Rita was not his intended target. She was a consequence, an obstacle between him and her daughter. Amanda was subjected to a level of violence that is genuinely difficult to put into words. She was bludgeoned. She was sexually assaulted with a baseball bat. She was mutilated, her breasts removed, her genitalia excised, the skin placed deliberately across her face in a staged, ritualistic arrangement. Her mother's remains were positioned nearby. The scene, when it was discovered the following morning by a family member, looked less like a crime and more like some kind of depraved altar. He had also consumed her blood. A ski mask recovered days later had Amanda's blood smeared near the mouth opening. The forensic implication was unambiguous. At 2 a.m, less than 2 hours after leaving that house, a police officer in East Wenatchee stopped a man in a VFW Hall car park on suspicion of burglary. The man was calm, cooperative. He answered every question without visible anxiety. His name was Jack Owen Spillman. In the area around his truck, officers found a 12-inch knife covered in blood, matching a knife set from inside the Huffman home. But lab results would take time, and without confirmation, there was nothing concrete to hold him on. He was released. What followed was one of the most unnerving weeks in the history of that investigation. Detectives were almost certain they had their man. The knife, the witness, his proximity to the scene at 2 a.m. Everything pointed in one direction, but almost certain is not enough. And so, they watched him. Spillman, for his part, seemed utterly untroubled. He went about his days with the same quiet composure he had shown the officer who stopped him hours after 2 people lay dead less than a mile away. He disposed of the ski mask during those surveillance days. Carefully, he thought. He ran errands. He didn't flee. He didn't panic. He had studied enough criminal cases to understand that panic was what got people caught. Detectives watching him from a distance later described the experience as deeply unsettling. There was something about the normalcy of it, the way he moved through ordinary daily life, unhurried, unbothered, that made the knowledge of what he had done feel almost surreal. This was not a man falling apart. This was not someone crumbling under the weight of what he had done. He had killed 2 people with extraordinary brutality fewer than 7 days earlier, and he appeared, by every visible measure, absolutely fine. Meanwhile, investigators were pulling his background, the rape charges, the burglary convictions, the assault record. And then something else surfaced. He had previously stayed with a family in Tonasket. The younger daughter of that family had gone missing the previous year, a 9-year-old girl named Penny Davis. The walls were closing in from 2 directions simultaneously. When the blood on the knife was confirmed as belonging to the Huffman victims, and the hair fibers in his vehicle were matched, and the ski mask he thought he had discarded cleanly came back with Amanda's blood at the mouth, the case collapsed around him all at once. Neighbors placed him in the vicinity of Amanda's regular movements in the weeks before the murders. There was no explanation that held. Spillman was arrested, and for the first time, the armor of calm composure he had worn throughout showed the first visible crack. Not guilt, not remorse, but the cold arithmetic of a man who had run the numbers and realized the death penalty was now sitting directly in front of him. Facing execution, Spillman made a calculation. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He confessed, without being prompted, to the killing of Penny Davis, stunning the Okanagan County investigators who had never formally charged him. In exchange, the death penalty was removed. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on April 30th, 1996. He was 27 years old. In the years that followed, conversations Spillman had with multiple cellmates at Washington State Penitentiary filtered back through court records and investigator reports. He told them, more than once and with apparent pride, that his ambition was to become the world's greatest serial killer. He spoke about his victims with the detachment of someone recounting a completed project. He described his methodology, the surveillance, the forensic countermeasures, the months of patient preparation, with the enthusiasm of a man discussing a craft he had devoted himself to mastering. He described himself consistently as a werewolf, not as metaphor, not as performance. He believed it. He told his cellmate that when he stalked a victim, he felt himself change, that he moved through darkness as something older and hungrier and without conscience. That self-image wasn't constructed for the courtroom. By every account, it was the sincere, settled internal world of Jack Owen Spillman. Forensic psychologists later speculated he may have experienced clinical lycanthropy, a documented but extraordinarily rare psychiatric condition involving the genuine delusion of transforming into an animal. He was never formally diagnosed. He was never deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. As far as the law was concerned, Jack Spillman knew precisely what he was doing, every single time. He was featured on Investigation Discovery's Most Evil and rated at level 22, the highest score on their scale of evil, a score, notably, that no one else on that program had reached. He is still alive, still at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he has spent the last 3 decades in a cell that looks like every other cell in that building. He has never expressed remorse. He has never recanted a single word of what he told his cellmates. The man who declared he wanted to be the most notorious serial killer in the world moves through his days quietly, calmly, unremarkable to anyone passing in the corridor, just like he did that night, standing next to a bloody knife, convincing a police officer there was absolutely nothing to see. In the spring of 1990, somewhere in the darkness of rural North Korea, a 15-year-old girl lay sleeping in a crowded dormitory. She was one of dozens of students sent to work the harvest on a collective farm, miles from her family, miles from anything resembling safety. The room was quiet except for the sounds of exhausted teenagers breathing in the humid night air, rows of thin mattresses on wooden platforms, the faint glow of a distant security light through dirty windows. She had spent the day bent double in the fields, her back aching, her hands raw. All she wanted was sleep. She had no idea that at that very moment, someone was watching her through the window. Someone was studying the layout of the room, counting the sleeping bodies, choosing his target, and that someone had already decided she would not see the morning. What happened next would send shockwaves through one of the most secretive nations on Earth. It would cause an entire city to refuse to leave their homes after dark. It would force the authorities to confront a failure so profound that they would try to erase it from history. And it would reveal a killer whose crimes were so disturbing that even the North Korean government, a regime that buries almost everything beneath propaganda and silence, could not keep this story buried forever. This is the story of Park Myung-sik, a man the media would later call the organ harvester. Park Myung-sik was born in 1951 during one of the most turbulent periods in Korean history. The Korean War had just erupted, tearing the peninsula apart with artillery fire and ideology. Foreign armies trampled the land. Cities were reduced to rubble. Into this chaos, Park entered the world. What his childhood looked like, we do not know. North Korea is the most secretive country in the world. Information does not flow in, and it certainly does not flow out. When defectors eventually shared details of Park's crimes decades later, they knew almost nothing about his early years. His childhood is a void, a blank space in a story already full of shadows. What we do know is this. At some point, Park settled in Simpo, a port city on the eastern coast of North Korea in South Hamgyong province. It is a grey, industrial place, known for its shipyards and fisheries. Park worked in one of the city's factories, grinding through shifts in the system designed to extract maximum labour for minimum reward. By all accounts from his colleagues, he was unremarkable. Timid was the word they used. Quiet. Forgettable. He was the kind of man you would pass on the street and never remember. In North Korea, standing out is dangerous. Anonymity is survival. Park had mastered the art of being invisible. But by his late 30s, something was happening inside Park's body. Something was failing him in ways that could not be hidden. For years, Park had been suffering from cirrhosis of the liver. In North Korea in the late 1980s, hepatitis B was rampant due to poor sanitation and inadequate vaccination programs. Chronic infection often progressed to cirrhosis, the slow and irreversible scarring of liver tissue. The pain would have been constant at first, a dull ache beneath his ribs, but over time, it would have sharpened into something unbearable. The fatigue would have been crushing. His skin may have yellowed. His belly may have swollen with fluid. He was dying slowly and painfully, and he knew it with terrible certainty. Park sought treatment at a hospital in Hamhung, the second largest city in North Korea. He was seen by a doctor described as famous, someone with a reputation for skill. The treatment failed. Park tried again. It failed again. North Korea's healthcare system, particularly for ordinary workers without elite connections, was already strained to breaking point. Resources went to the military first, then to party officials. Workers like Park were given whatever scraps remained. The pain grew worse. The weakness deepened. Hope evaporated. He was facing a slow, agonizing death, and no one in his country could stop it. Then Park overheard something at the factory. A co-worker mentioned, in hushed tones, a fortune teller who could help with problems that medicine could not solve. Now, you need to understand something. In North Korea, religious practices are forbidden. The state is the religion. Kim Il-sung is the god. His portrait hangs in every home. To worship anything else is an act of treason. Shamanism and fortune-telling existed only in the shadows, practiced in secret, whispered about in back rooms. To seek out a fortune-teller was to step outside the system entirely. Park was desperate enough to take that step. His co-worker made the introduction. It had to be done carefully, with constant vigilance for informers. But eventually, Park found himself sitting across from a fortune teller, begging for answers. He described his pain, his failed treatments, his certainty of approaching death. At first, the fortune teller refused, but Park would not stop pleading. His agony was obvious, written on his yellowing skin. His desperation was absolute. Finally, the fortune teller relented. He looked at the dying man before him and delivered the advice that would turn Park Myung-sik into a monster. The only way to cure his disease, the fortune teller said, was to consume human livers, fresh ones, from young, healthy people. Their vitality would transfer to Park. It was ancient wisdom. It was the only way. Park went home terrified. The idea of killing another human being, of cutting them open and taking their organs, was monstrous beyond comprehension. For a time, he did nothing. He continued working at the factory. He continued suffering through his nights. But the pain did not stop. It got worse. Week after week, his body deteriorated. The fortune teller's words echoed in his mind, growing louder as his options grew smaller. And slowly, horribly, Park convinced himself that it would be better to try than to die in agony. In April 1990, Park Myung-sik began to hunt. To understand what happened next, you need to understand how North Korea uses its children. Every year, the government mobilizes students for agricultural labor. This is not voluntary. Middle school and high school students, some as young as 14, are dispatched to collective farms for weeks or months at a time. They plant crops, they pull weeds, they harvest grain under the brutal sun. They live in dormitories at the farms, crude buildings with minimal facilities, far from their families and far from any real supervision. The system creates vulnerability on an industrial scale, and Park Myung-sik realized this with predatory clarity. His method was consistent and terrifying in its simplicity. He would travel to rural areas outside Sinpo, searching for collective farms where students had been sent. He would watch the dormitories. He would study the routines. He would wait for the right moment, usually at night, when exhaustion had pulled the students into deep sleep. Then he would strike. His first confirmed victim was that 15-year-old girl sleeping in the dormitory. Park broke in during the darkness. He moved silently through the room full of sleeping teenagers until he found her. Then he clamped his hand over her mouth and stabbed her with a knife. He began dragging her bleeding body toward the door, intending to take her somewhere he could complete his work. But as he carried her into the night, dogs began to bark nearby. The sound shattered the silence. Park panicked. He dropped the girl and fled into the darkness. She was found the next morning, still alive but barely. She died of her injuries later that day. A few days later, a farmer at a nearby farm made a discovery that would haunt him forever. He was walking through a field when he saw something that did not belong. A shape in the dirt. A human shape. He approached, and what he found was so horrifying that he fainted on the spot. It was the body of another student. The victim had been stabbed multiple times, but that was not what made the farmer lose consciousness. The victim's abdomen had been torn open. The cavity where the liver should have been was empty. Park Myung-sik had completed his ritual for the first time. The Sinpo City Police Department was called in to investigate, but they were completely unprepared. North Korean police in 1990 did not have forensic technology. As they searched for answers and found nothing, some investigators reportedly whispered that perhaps this was not the work of a human at all. Perhaps it was a ghost. But the ghost was very much alive, and he was not finished. A few days later, another corpse appeared in downtown Sinpo itself. A woman in her early 20s, possibly a farm worker. Her injuries were identical. Her abdomen had been opened. Her liver had been taken. Over the following months, the killings continued with sickening regularity. One victim after another, found in fields and buildings throughout Sinpo and its surroundings. Park's approach evolved. He would offer rides to students traveling to their farm assignments. He would offer assistance, playing the helpful older man. Once he had them alone, he would attack. Some victims he strangled, some he bludgeoned. All of them he stabbed, and all of them, once dead or dying, he opened up and harvested. He consumed the organs raw. Park Myung-sik ate raw human livers. He truly believed this was medicine. He truly believed that by ingesting the livers of healthy young people, he could absorb their vitality and heal his own destroyed organ the fortune teller had promised him. And so he kept killing, kept cutting, kept consuming, even as his cirrhosis continued to ravage him, even as his health showed no improvement whatsoever. Meanwhile, the people of Sinpo were descending into panic. 12 young people had vanished or been found mutilated in 6 months. The government controlled the media, but it could not control fear. People talked, people warned each other, and people stopped going outside after dark. The local party secretary found himself in an impossible position. When he traveled to Pyongyang for meetings, his colleagues mocked him openly. They called him the murderous general. His city had produced a monster, and he could not catch it. Here is something crucial to understand about North Korea. The government sees everything, or at least it is supposed to. Surveillance is woven into daily life. Neighbors spy on neighbors. Every building has informers. This total surveillance is presented as protection. But the party could not find Park Myung-sik. For 6 months, a serial killer operated freely in one of the most controlled societies on earth. He murdered at will. He eluded capture. Every day, Park remained uncaught, exposed the lies at the heart of the system. But no one can stay invisible forever. It was October 1990 when the organ harvester finally made a mistake. Park spotted another target, a student traveling to work on a collective farm. He approached her with his usual ruse. An offer of help, a friendly word, but something went wrong. Perhaps she noticed something in his manner. Whatever happened, she ran, and Park ran too, but in the wrong direction. Vigilant citizens spotted him fleeing. They saw a man running where no one should be running, and in a society where collective action is mandated, they did not hesitate. They chased him down. They caught him. They dragged him to the police station. When Park was interrogated, there was no point in resistance. He confessed to everything. He told them about all 12 victims. He described the dormitory break-in, the sleeping girl, the barking dogs. He described the farms, the isolated roads, the students he had killed. He described how he cut them open and removed their livers, how he consumed the organs raw. He told them about the fortune teller. The fortune teller was arrested as well. Park spent a year in detention awaiting trial. North Korean detention facilities are notorious for brutality. For a man already dying of liver failure, that year must have been agony. In mid-October 1991, Park appeared before the People's Court in Sinpo. He pleaded guilty. The court convicted him and sentenced him to death. Sometime that same month, Park Myung-sik was executed by firing squad. He was approximately 40 years old. He had killed at least 12 people. He had eaten their livers raw, and it had all been for nothing. The fortune teller received 15 years in a penal labor colony. Remarkably, he survived the full term. He was released in 2006 and deported to another province. His fate after that is unknown. For 15 years, the story of Park Myung-sik remained buried in North Korea's silence. The regime does not acknowledge its failures. It does not publicize its monsters. But memories survive and people escape. In December 2006, the South Korean newspaper, Daily NK, published an article about the case. The information came from defectors who had carried the story across the border, who had lived through those terrifying months and remembered what the state wanted everyone to forget. The article criticized the North Korean government for its censorship and denial of religious freedom, noting that Park had turned to a fortune teller precisely because the state offered no hope and no alternatives. The story spread, and the world learned about the organ harvester. There are things we will never know. Park Myung-sik was not a genius. He was not a mastermind evading brilliant investigators through superior intellect. He was an ordinary, desperate, dying man who made a monstrous choice. And that is perhaps the most terrifying thing about his story. Not how unusual it is, but how understandable it becomes when you examine the context. A country that offers its people nothing but slogans and surveillance. A healthcare system that cannot save them when they get sick. A surveillance state that monitors every word, but still cannot prevent evil from walking freely for 6 months. A folk superstition that rushes in to fill the void left by failed ideology. Park Myung-sik is a mirror reflecting everything wrong with North Korea, and the reflection is horrifying. None of that excuses what he did, but it explains how an ordinary factory worker, timid and forgettable, could transform into something monstrous.